Why did a moment of laughter coming from the guard side of the camp make German prisoners fall silent at once? And how could a sound with no orders, no threats, and no meaning begin to feel more dangerous than punishment itself? The sound did not arrive suddenly, nor did it interrupt anything directly, which was why it unsettled the men before they could even decide what they were reacting to, because it blended into the air of the camp without demanding attention, yet refused to disappear once it had been noticed. It drifted in from beyond the wire, light and uneven, rising and falling as though it belonged to a moment that had nothing to do with captivity, and that alone was enough to cause hands to pause in mid-movement, fingers tightening slightly around belts, tools, or fabric, as heads turned in the same cautious direction without anyone giving a signal to do so. They had learned to recognize danger by sound. Orders carried a sharpness that cut through space. Boots striking gravel with purpose meant something specific, and even silence, when it lasted too long, had taught them to prepare for consequence. But this sound fit none of those patterns, and that made it harder to dismiss. Laughter suggested ease, and ease suggested a level of control so complete that it no longer needed to prove itself, because only those who felt entirely secure could afford to be careless with noise, and careless authority was more difficult to anticipate than anger. Inside the barracks, the day continued as it always had, with men adjusting uniforms, preparing for work details, and moving around one another with the quiet efficiency of people who had learned that unnecessary motion attracted attention. Yet the sound slipped through the open spaces, settling into the room as though it had been invited. No one commented on it at first. To speak too quickly would have meant acknowledging uncertainty. And uncertainty inside a camp was something every man learned to hide, because questions had a way of spreading faster than answers, and answers were rarely comforting. Some assumed the sound would fade on its own, that it was nothing more than ordinary conversation carried by the wind. Yet when it returned again, slightly louder and closer, the assumption weakened, replaced by a growing awareness that this was not accidental background noise, but something persistent. Men began watching the guards differently, not for signs of anger or readiness, but for any indication that the sound belonged to a coordinated action, a glance exchanged, a movement repeated, a posture that suggested preparation. Yet the guards appeared unchanged, moving through their duties with the same detached rhythm they always had, offering no visible reaction to the sound that was tightening the camp around them. That absence of reaction unsettled the prisoners more than any response might have, because it suggested that the laughter was not meant to communicate anything at all, and that possibility carried its own threat. If the sound had no message, then it did not exist for them. And if it did not exist for them, then it existed entirely outside their influence, untouched by their behavior, and therefore immune to their understanding. As the morning wore on, the men found themselves listening for it, even when it was not present, straining to separate ordinary noise from its memory, because once something unfamiliar entered the camp, it did not leave easily, but lingered as expectation. A few whispered guesses passed between bunks and work lines, cautious and unfinished, each man offering just enough to test the reaction of the others. Yet no explanation held long, because every explanation assumed intention, and intention implied a logic none of them could see. When the laughter surfaced again near midday, softer this time, it produced a different reaction. Not fear, not anger, but a quiet sense of exclusion, as though the guards were participating in a version of life that no longer included the men who heard it, a reminder that somewhere beyond the wire, the war did not define every moment, and that realization carried a humiliation deeper than command ever could. The prisoners did not respond outwardly. They stood, worked, and waited as expected, yet the sound continued to shape the space around them. altering posture, tightening attention, and sharpening awareness without ever announcing its purpose. By evening, when the camp returned to its familiar sequence of counting, eating, and enforced quiet, the laughter had faded, yet it remained present in another form, replaying in memory as the men lay in their bunks, listening to the ordinary noises they had learned to accept. And in the dark, where imagination filled the gaps left by silence, the sound took on weight, not because it had explained anything, but because it had introduced a question that no one could answer. And questions, once planted inside a place like this, rarely stayed contained. The change did not arrive with the sound itself, but with the way one man responded to it, because reactions, unlike noises, carried meaning even when no one explained them, and meaning inside the camp never went unnoticed for long. He was not new, not weak, and not someone the others would have expected to lose composure. A man who had survived months of routine without drawing attention, blending into the rhythm of the barracks with the practiced restraint of someone who understood how visibility could become a liability. When the laughter drifted in again, faint but unmistakable, he did not turn his head like the others. He froze, not in fear, not in shock, but in a way that suggested calculation, as though he were weighing whether movement itself had become dangerous, and the stillness of his posture drew more attention than any sudden motion could have. Those nearest to him noticed first, then others further away, not because he stood out visually, but because the absence of response created a contrast the camp could not ignore, and soon eyes were shifting toward him in brief, careful glances that pretended to be elsewhere. He kept his gaze fixed forward, jaw set tighter than necessary, hands held unnaturally still at his sides, while the sound faded and returned again, each repetition met with the same rigid refusal to acknowledge it. No one spoke to him. Speaking would have required admitting that something was happening, and no one yet understood what kind of attention that admission might invite, so the men watched instead, learning through observation what they could not ask aloud. The guards remained unchanged. They did not look toward the man, nor did they alter their patrols, reinforcing the sense that whatever had just occurred existed entirely outside the formal structure of control, which made it more difficult to interpret and therefore more unsettling. As the day progressed, the man's stillness became harder to dismiss. While others shifted their weight, adjusted clothing, or leaned briefly against walls, he remained fixed in place for longer than comfort allowed. And when he finally moved, it was with deliberate slowness, as though testing whether motion itself had become conditional. Later, during the meal, when the laughter surfaced again from beyond the yard, he did something no one expected. He stood up, not abruptly, not defiantly, but quietly, pushing back from the bench and stepping away from the table without explanation, leaving his food untouched as he moved toward the edge of the space where shadows gathered. No order stopped him. No guard addressed him. The absence of response unsettled the others more than intervention would have, because it suggested that the camp did not require consistency to function, and that unpredictability itself might be part of the structure now. A few men exchanged looks, not questioning, not accusing, but measuring, because the reaction had created a new variable, and variables inside captivity demanded attention whether anyone wanted them to or not. The man did not return to his seat. He stood where he had stopped, back straight, eyes lowered, remaining there until the sound faded once more, and only then did he move again, returning to his place with the same deliberate restraint he had shown before. No explanation followed. No acknowledgement passed between him and the others. Yet the reaction lingered in the air long after the moment had ended, reshaping how the sound was received the next time it appeared. Because now the prisoners were no longer listening only to the laughter. They were watching each other. They were measuring responses, comparing restraint, and quietly adjusting their own behavior in anticipation of a rule that had not been announced but was beginning to suggest itself through imitation. By evening, the sound had not returned, yet its influence remained present in the way men positioned themselves, in the care with which they moved, and in the shared understanding that whatever this was, it did not need explanation to be effective. It only needed to be observed once. By the time the next laugh reached them, it no longer sounded accidental, and that was what made it dangerous. It came from beyond the fence line again, drifting in the same direction as the dust and the sun heat, casual and unguarded, the kind of sound that belonged to people who were not watching their words. The prisoners turned their heads, almost in sync, not because they expected answers, but because they could not stop their mind from treating laughter as a signal, and in captivity, every signal mattered. They tried to name what exactly felt wrong about it, but the discomfort did not come from volume or mockery. It was not the sharp laugh of men pointing at something humiliating, and it was not the cruel laugh that followed pain. It was soft, scattered, and ordinary, as if someone had said something stupid near a work truck, as if someone had missed a step and caught himself in time, as if the world outside the wire still allowed small mistakes to be harmless. That ordinariness pressed on them more than an insult would have, because an insult would have confirmed their expectations, while this sounded like a life that continued without needing them. At lunch, the prisoners sat with their trays and watched the American guards the way they had watched them from the first day, looking for patterns that could be turned into protection. The guards spoke to each other in a rhythm that included pauses and jokes and familiar nicknames, and their faces moved in ways that did not seem controlled or staged. None of them looked toward the prisoners when they laughed, and the lack of attention was unsettling, because it suggested the prisoners were not even important enough to mock, and that idea struck at something deeper than fear. A few men began to argue quietly about what laughter could mean in a place built for captivity. One insisted it was a tactic, a deliberate performance meant to weaken them by proving that their suffering had not disturbed anyone's day. Another insisted it was a trap because nothing was ever given freely, not even sound, not even the illusion of normal life. A third simply stared at his food and said that perhaps it meant nothing at all, and the others reacted as if he had said something obscene, because meaninglessness was harder to fight than malice. By the fourth day, the laughter no longer needed to return in order to be felt, because its presence had already settled into the behavior of the camp, shaping reactions before sound ever reached the yard. And that was when the men began to understand that whatever had been introduced could now operate without reinforcement. They moved differently, not dramatically, not in a way that would attract notice, but with a restraint that had shifted from discipline to calculation, as though each movement were being weighed against an invisible standard that none of them could define, yet all of them sensed. Conversations thinned. Words that once passed quietly between bunks or along work lines were now shortened or abandoned entirely, not because the men feared being overheard, but because speech itself felt exposed, as if talking too freely might invite comparison with a world that could still afford laughter. The guards continued their routines unchanged, which only deepened the effect, because the absence of reaction confirmed that the adjustment was not being enforced from above, but generated from within, spreading through imitation rather than command. At meals, men sat longer with their trays untouched, eyes lowered, chewing slowed to a rhythm that felt cautious rather than hungry, while glances occasionally drifted toward the fence line, not searching for guards, but listening for a sound that might not come, and preparing for the feeling it would leave behind if it did. One prisoner attempted to break the tension by making a quiet remark, something neutral and harmless, a comment about the heat or the quality of the food, yet the response was uneven and restrained, with no laughter in return, only nods or brief acknowledgments, because humor now felt risky, not forbidden, but misplaced. The idea that laughter belonged somewhere else had taken hold. It belonged beyond the wire, beyond the schedules, beyond the numbered routines that defined their days. And by accepting that division, the men had drawn a boundary inside themselves that the camp no longer needed to maintain. Work details became quieter. Tools were handled with precision. Tasks completed efficiently. Yet the usual murmurs that once filled the gaps between movements had faded, replaced by a collective attentiveness that felt heavier than fatigue, because attention without purpose demanded constant effort. The laughter, when it returned briefly in the distance that afternoon, did not provoke the same tightening of posture it once had, because its work had already been done, and instead it passed through the camp like a reminder rather than a disruption, confirming what the men had already begun to accept. That acceptance did not bring peace. It brought a subtle narrowing of focus, as though the prisoners were shrinking their inner world to protect it from comparison, choosing predictability over curiosity, restraint over reaction, because curiosity had become painful. At night, sleep came unevenly. Some men drifted off quickly, exhausted by the effort of constant self-monitoring, while others lay awake, replaying moments from earlier days when laughter had been harmless, when sound did not need to be interpreted, and wondering how easily that version of life had been left behind. No one spoke of change. Change was acknowledged only through behavior, through the way men avoided meeting one another's eyes when sound drifted in from beyond the fence, and through the way silence began to feel safer than any attempt to reclaim ease. By the time darkness settled fully over the camp, it was clear that something irreversible had occurred, because the laughter no longer needed to appear in order to influence them, and the men had learned, without instruction, that control could be exercised simply by revealing how different the outside world still was. And in that realization, the camp grew quieter, not because rules demanded it, but because the prisoners themselves had begun to enforce a separation between who they were allowed to be inside the wire and who they remembered being before sound itself became a reminder of everything they could no longer reach. By the fifth day, the camp had not become louder or harsher, nor had it tightened its rules or altered its routines in any visible way. Yet something essential had shifted beneath the surface, because the men no longer reacted to the laughter as an interruption, but as a condition they had already absorbed. The sounds still appear from time to time, faint and distant, never close enough to demand confrontation, never loud enough to force a response. And that distance was what made it effective, because it allowed the prisoners to anticipate it without ever knowing when it would arrive. Anticipation replaced surprise. Men adjusted their posture before the sound appeared, lowered their voices before conversation began, and moderated their expressions in advance, as though preparing for judgment that might never come. And this preparation became second nature with unsettling speed. The guards did nothing to reinforce this shift. They neither encouraged nor discouraged it, continuing their movements with the same detached consistency, which made the transformation feel self-generated, as though the prisoners were adapting not to authority, but to an internal understanding of how the camp now functioned. What disappeared first was casual speech. Words were still exchanged when necessary. Instructions followed, questions answered, yet anything unnecessary was quietly removed, not through fear of punishment, but through a shared sense that ease no longer belonged in this space. The laughter, when it surfaced again near midday, produced no visible reaction at all. No heads turned, no hands paused. The men continued working as if the sound were part of the environment, like wind or distant machinery. And in doing so, they confirmed that they had already made the adjustment the sound had demanded. Later, during the meal, one prisoner allowed himself a brief smile at a private thought, a reflex from another life, and immediately corrected it, not because anyone had noticed, but because it felt inappropriate, as though he had violated an unspoken agreement, that no one remembered making. That agreement had taken shape without force. It existed in the collective restraint, in a way men avoided emotional extremes, and in how carefully they measured themselves against a standard that no longer came from guards or rules, but from an internalized boundary between captivity and a world beyond it. As afternoon wore on, the camp appeared unusually efficient. Tasks were completed without delay, lines formed neatly, and compliance was immediate. Yet this efficiency did not feel like order restored, but like something narrower, something stripped of resistance and even of expectation. The men were no longer waiting for laughter to mean something. They had already accepted what it represented. By evening, the sound did not return, and for the first time since it had begun, its absence went unnoticed, because its influence had become permanent, shaping behavior even in silence. The camp settled into quiet with remarkable ease, and that ease carried its own weight, because it revealed how thoroughly the men had adjusted to a condition that had never been explained and never needed to be. As the lights dimmed and the prisoners lay in their bunks, the air felt heavier than before, not with fear, but with the realization that something had been surrendered without a struggle, something subtle and difficult to name, yet deeply personal. They had not been ordered to change. They had not been punished into silence. They had simply learned, by proximity alone, that another world existed nearby, a world where men could laugh without consequence, and that knowledge had reshaped them more effectively than discipline ever could. And in that understanding, the camp reached a new equilibrium, one that required no reinforcement, because the lesson had already been absorbed, and whatever came next would arrive not into confusion or resistance, but into minds that had already learned how to limit themselves. When the laughter finally stopped, no one noticed at first, not because it had been insignificant, but because its effect no longer depended on its presence, having already reshaped the way the men inhabited the camp and themselves within it. The days continued with the same structure, the same schedules, and the same outward calm, yet the prisoners moved through them with an awareness that had not existed before, an awareness that sound alone, without threat or instruction, could redraw the boundaries of behavior. No explanation was ever offered. The guards never addressed the laughter, never acknowledged its impact, and never treated it as anything other than ordinary background noise, which ensured that the questions it raised remained unanswered and therefore more powerful than any official clarification could have been. The men did not speak of it either. What had happened did not lend itself to language, because language implied cause and intention, and this experience had revealed something more unsettling. That influence did not always require intention, and that control could emerge naturally when contrast was allowed to exist without comment. Some prisoners convinced themselves that nothing had changed, that the camp was no different than it had been before, while others sensed that a quiet adjustment had taken place, one that would not announce itself and would not easily reverse, because it had been absorbed rather than imposed. The memory of laughter did not follow them as fear. It followed them as comparison. It lingered as a reminder that somewhere nearby, life had continued with room for error, ease, and unguarded moments, while inside the wire, every reaction had learned to measure itself against an invisible line. Long after the sound itself was forgotten, its lesson remained intact, shaping restraint without commands, silence without enforcement, and compliance without resistance, proving that authority did not always need to raise its voice to be understood. And when the prisoners eventually left the camp, what they carried with them was not anger toward the men who had laughed, nor gratitude toward those who had not explained it, but a quieter understanding of how easily the human mind could be shaped by proximity alone. Because once a man learns to limit himself in response to something that was never directed at him, he does not forget that lesson, and he does not need to hear the sound again for its influence to remain. For more untold World War II stories like this, subscribe to WW2 Chronicle Vault and continue the journey with us.